here once again. We are now in our third week of this class that we've called Values Adrift. This week we're going to be looking at, as I told you in the past, this whole phenomenon in the history of Western culture, which plays a very important part in the formation of the Constitution, this area that's called the Age of Reason. However, if you'll recall, I left a dangling loose end last week, and I didn't want to leave that particular discussion without finishing it off. So we'll do that as well at the beginning here. Last week, then, we shifted our focus and looked at that branch in Western culture which has attempted consciously to apply the Judeo-Christian model of law. We find that largely in the Reformation and also in the Puritan movement that comes thereafter, a self-conscious, deliberate effort to take the Judeo-Christian approach and actually make it work. And of course that's important for us because the Puritans, who absorbed on the one hand the Reformation mentality, were attempting to construct just that when they began their work in the New England colonies and to some extent within the Plymouth colony as well. So we have that great contributing branch, and tonight I want to look at the other branch. This other branch would go back not to the Judeo-Christian sources, but rather to the Greek sources of Plato and Aristotle, which comes down through history more or less in the form of a debate. This debate that went on between those two figures was not resolved by them, but throughout history the debate has continued. And the Age of Reason is really the story of a debate. And the debate is going on at the time the Constitution is framed. And we see something of the debate in the Constitution. So that's what I want to try to work with tonight. All right, with that much introduction, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll get underway. Father, we give you thanks once again for the opportunity of gathering here in this place with your people. We pray now that as we turn our attention to this other great contributing source that's led up to the formation of the constitutional documents, that our consideration of these matters would once again inform us in a significant way and give us the equipment that we need to be not only Christians who have a deeper understanding, but also citizens who have some better grasp of what the role is that we should be playing in our culture and in our world. We pray that we might rise to these opportunities with courage and faith and industry and energy. And we give you thanks for it in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, well, last week, right at the end of our discussion, I was attempting to note with you some of the contributing values that come to us through American history, really through the values of America, or Americanism, if I can use such a term, that are rooted in the Puritan thought. And we looked, for example, at the sovereignty of God. We saw how that translates into certain political ideas. We looked at total depravity, you'll recall, and looked at how that also has some political ramifications. The one point I didn't get to at the end of our discussion was what I'm calling covenant, or a covenant view of theology and its political overtones. The Puritans were committed to something called covenant theology, which I really can't get into at all in any detail, but simply to say this, that in many ways the relationship between humanity and deity was understood in covenant terms, which is to say it was almost a contract interpretation. God is making agreements with the human race. Now, some of those agreements are with a subset of the human race. For example, an agreement or a covenant between God and the church, or God and Israel. But there's at least one point where this covenant is expressed in terms of a relationship between God and humanity, as humanity, not humanity as Jew or humanity as Christian. And these are thus values that are understood as being incumbent upon all humanity. And they are found at the point of creation, and thus it is sometimes called the creation covenant. And so the Puritans, as they examined the creation, particularly the early chapters of Genesis, distilled four basic values, which have been again reinterpreted and redefined throughout the history of theological thought. But my point here is to show you how we see these values translated into some of the classic values of our country. And we can trace this back in many ways to the Puritans and their estimation of these ideas. The first of them is the notion of Sabbath. You're probably aware that the notion of Sabbath does not have its advent in the Ten Commandments, but that we see Sabbath and the idea of Sabbath, that is a Sabbath day, in the creation. God creates for 6 days, then He takes a day off. And we have a Sabbath. And the notion that people should observe a Sabbath, you see, was understood as being part, at least implicit, within the creation covenant. The Puritans were very zealous about Sabbath keeping, and the notion that there should be a day which is set apart, in which we don't go out and work in the same way that we work the other 6 days. And of course, classically, some of you will recall, it's not that many years ago, that observing the Sabbath was a very common thing in this country, that people took Sundays off. That's changed pretty dramatically, and some who are younger might not even realize that that's part of the way it used to be in this country, but not so many years ago. Indeed, it was interesting reading a newspaper account of First Presbyterian Church in Spokane around the turn of the century, taking a very militant posture in this town against some practices going on the Sabbath. You see, opening shops. This church was arguing against that. Well, we haven't done that lately. But traditionally, that observance of the Sabbath was very important. Another feature of Puritanism was the notion of marriage. Again, we look at the creation account and we see that marriage is not something that comes after the fact, but it actually is part of the created order. Humanity has created male and female, and the idea of a man and a woman getting together in a bond, a relationship, that the sexual expression finds its appropriate existence within that bond of marriage as part of what the Puritans regarded as the creation covenant. And thus, again, we find traditionally in America, there's been a very heavy accent on the sanctity and the uniqueness, really, of the marriage covenant and the marriage relationship. And the notion of dissolving a marriage or treating a marriage as sort of a cheap or short-term thing was anathema, really, you see, in terms of a traditional understanding of the significance of marriage. And that was part of the Puritan understanding. The third area is stewardship of the creation. Again, as we look at the early chapters of Genesis, we see that there's an assignment that's given the human race. God doesn't create people, hand them a glass of lemonade and say, okay, enjoy. But He says, I want you to work. But the work takes place within the context of a joyful kind of enterprise of caring for this beautiful setting. And so the Puritans understood that part of the task that we're given is nurturing and caring for and overseeing in a responsible kind of way the earth. The Puritans, in many ways, were ecologists. They appreciated, in some ways that we have lost, the value and the sanctity of work, and particularly of caring for the planet. The last element, the last point that was important, was the whole idea of the sanctity and the value of life. Again, as we look at the creation narrative, we find that life does not just happen more or less spontaneously, but it happens as an immediate creative expression of God. He breathes, and life takes place, human life. And the Puritans placed a very heavy accent on the sanctity and the value of human life, and that's been traditionally part of American understanding, which again I think we see a great deal of compromise at that point as well in more contemporary thought. So those areas, those are kind of basic ideas that played a role in Puritanism traditionally that we see coming down, kind of reverberating through our culture's value system. All right, so that finishes up last week, and now we move on quickly to our subject matter for the evening. We've been looking at the Judeo-Christian understanding, and we saw how that was applied by the Reformers, by the Puritans. There's another great tradition which roots not in the biblical sources or Judeo-Christian tradition, but really goes back to Greek thought, and particularly Greek humanism, And it shows up probably first of all in any significant kind of way at the time of the Renaissance, and then is pushed along in at several other points along the way. Again, to really appreciate the Renaissance and what it stood for, it's helpful to have in mind the Middle Ages, and we looked at this last week. I have another genius overhead for you here that, you shouldn't laugh. People listening by tape are going to think these are great overheads and that they're really missing something, and I should assure them that whoever they may be out there, Mr. and Mrs. America, that these overheads are really not much to be missed. But in any event, you'll see I've made a distinction. We have the same horizontal line that we've been using in the past, the same line that distinguished the ideal from the receptacle, distinguished God from creation, distinguished the supernatural from the natural. Here we're distinguishing grace from nature. In the Middle Ages, the distinction between grace and nature, that nature-grace distinction was a very important part of the theology and philosophy of the time. Now, last week we were looking at the Middle Ages primarily to illustrate the relationship between church and state, and I was indicating to you that toward the end of the Middle Ages, the church had really gained a position of prominence, indeed of ascendancy, in the Western world, so that pretty much the state was on its knees at the beck and call of the church. Now, one of the ways in which the church's control of the culture at that time was expressed was by placing a profound emphasis on grace as opposed to nature. Grace standing for all things related to God, all things that are holy, that are otherworldly, that are out there as opposed to down here. So in the late Middle Ages, we have a sense in which the only important things, the only things that matter are those things that are of grace, and nature is relatively unimportant. And you see this illustrated in many ways. If you're familiar, for example, with the music of the Middle Ages, you know that it's not really kind of get down and get excited kind of music. It's more this sort of very spooky sound. If you're, for example, Gregorian chant, if you've ever studied music, you know it has kind of almost a strange, spooky, otherworldly. You have these monks singing in chapels and the sound in big hollow cathedrals. You listen to it and it sounds like it's coming almost from another dimension. You see a strange kind of sound. Why was that? I mean, that was a deliberate thing. And the idea was to make people feel grace as opposed to nature, the natural instincts, you see, of a beat and kind of a brighter sound. You look at the architecture of the time, and for example, these great Gothic cathedrals with their spires pointing to the sky. You look at them, and the eye, just by the design, the architecture, the eye is called up, and the point is to the sky, to grace. And the idea is there's nothing down here to worry about. You look up. That's what's important, you see. Or you think, for example, of the art of the time. If you've seen medieval art, Byzantine art, for example, you know that, for example, pictures of the Virgin Mary. You look at them and you think, boy, she's ugly. And really, with all due respect, she is in the Middle Ages. Because she's not portrayed as a lovely 16-year-old Jewish girl. She's portrayed as a sort of otherworldly figure with a strange kind of distorted face, and even the baby Jesus looks strange and kind of out of whack a little bit. And we sometimes look at that and think, boy, those people were terrible artists. And it's not right. They were wonderful artists. This was an intentional distortion. They were doing this purposely because they were trying to say these religious figures are of another place. They're in grace. They're in the holy. You see, they're out there, otherworldly. And thus they are not portrayed naturally. They're unnatural. And the Middle Ages was really characterized by that kind of thing. There's more that could be said about that, but that at least illustrates the point. Well, the Renaissance, that really was born in southern Italy, particularly around Florence in the 15th century, represented, as the name implies, a rebirth. Not just a rebirth of interest in life, but in a very particular sense, a rebirth of Greek thought. And thus what we find in the Renaissance and the thinkers of the Renaissance was an entirely new accent on things human, as had been the case among the Greeks. So the shift really represents a shift downward, where there's no longer such an over-accent on grace, but there begins to be more of an accent on nature. And you look at the art of the Renaissance, and you see this immediately. The music of the Renaissance, much brighter. There's actually something of a rhythm, you see, to it. Much more listenable, not so spooky as this chanting sound of the Middle Ages. You look at the architecture, and now the chief architectural device is no longer the spire, but the dome. Now, the difference between a spire and a dome is that a spire calls your eye upward. A dome is a half circle, and the eye naturally goes to the center of the circle. So as you look at a dome, your eye is called downward, to this world, to nature. And thus one of the characteristics of the Renaissance was a focus here as opposed to a focus there. You look at the art of the Renaissance, Michelangelo, you see, who's a great sculptor, and of course he's not sculpting otherworldly figures. If you're familiar with the life of Michelangelo, you know that at one point in his life, when he was young, he spent quite a bit of time dissecting cadavers, which was illegal. But he was so concerned about knowing what's in this body. How can I sculpt this thing unless I know what this is? I don't have much, but some people have these muscles that sort of ripple there. What is that stuff that makes the body look the way it does? And he spent almost a year of his life sneaking in and taking bodies apart so he could sculpt them. Well, that's not anything that people concerned about grace worried about. They didn't care about what was in the human body because these were figures of another place. But Michelangelo wanted to know about nature, what's here, you see. So you have this new focus on life on this planet, which really takes quite a dramatic turn then from the mentality of the Middle Ages. Now, the other thing that took place in the Renaissance, along with this rebirth of an interest in nature and humanity and humanism, was at the same time a rebirth of Greek skepticism. Recall that in the debate between Plato and Aristotle, one of the concerns was how do we know what the ideal is? And there is no way to test it out. You see, that was Aristotle's critique of Plato. I've never been to the ideal world. How do I even know it's there? And there's kind of a skeptical attitude about things ultimate and things eternal. And in the Renaissance, the same skepticism once again begins to surface. And the idea was that as we move in the direction of nature, we begin to have our doubts about the reality of grace. Now, I'm overstating this. The people of the Renaissance still tended to be highly religious. And, of course, the Medici family, one of the popes was a Medici figure, and the Medici family was one of the chief patrons of the Renaissance movement. So I don't want to overstate this. It was a complicated time politically and ecclesiastically. But as a general drift, in a sense, the Renaissance began to move away from this orientation to grace and began to place an accent again on nature, which represented something of the Greek mentality as well. So we have the Renaissance brewing in the 15th century. Last week we looked at the Reformation, which is a 16th century movement. And, of course, the Reformation and the Renaissance have two different philosophical bases. The Reformation was rooted in Judeo-Christian and biblical sources. The Renaissance is rooted in Hellenistic sources, pagan sources. But nevertheless, the Renaissance and the Reformation have a lot in common, at least in terms of certain objects. The Renaissance was concerned about the individual and was humanistically oriented, at least in a qualified sense. So is the Reformation. There was a kind of individualism and humanism in the Reformation. I mentioned last week Luther, as he stood before the church at the Diet of Worms, saying, unless I am convinced. You see, that's individualism. It's something of humanism. It's saying, unless this individual private human is convinced in this individual private conscience of the truth of what you say, I'm not going to believe it. Well, that's a shift And what I'm saying is that the Reformation, though it came from a different philosophical foundation, it gave a little bit of a reinforcement to the spirit of the Renaissance. It wasn't really antagonistic to the Renaissance. It wasn't in the same philosophical scheme, but it didn't really militate against it as sharply as we might have expected. In the Reformation, we had this criticism of authority. Luther says, you've got to convince me. I'm not going to take this implicitly. You've got to prove it to me. He's willing to criticize and question authority. And we see the same kind of thing in the Renaissance. So again, at that point, there's a common ground. It's possible, in other words, for figures of the Renaissance and figures of the Reformation to form a kind of loose coalition, at least at certain points where they agreed, even though philosophically they were coming from different assumptions. An individual like Desiderius Erasmus, a great Renaissance figure, had profound appreciation and respect for Martin Luther. Now, Erasmus and Luther, if you're familiar with that period of time, you know that they had their debates, and they had their dissension and disagreement, but nevertheless, there was something of a mutual respect between them. One is the Reformation, one is the Renaissance, and yet they could still agree on certain things. And my point is then that whatever was happening in the Renaissance starts something rolling, and you might say the Reformation gives it another push. Doesn't squelch it, but pushes it along. It gives it another little piece of energy. The other movement that occurs about this time, which is very important for our purposes, flows out of both the Renaissance and the Reformation and is usually called the birth of modern science or the scientific revolution, something like that. And this also has a very important impact in terms of steering Western culture away, in a sense, from its heavy orientation to the church and to a complete dependence on the church. There's many ways to illustrate this, but probably the most dramatic and interesting is in the world of astronomy. And the Ptolemaic view of the universe is geocentricity. Now you might think, well, that's kind of a museum piece view. I mean, we know better than that these days, which is, true. But the snag here, the problem is this. The Ptolemaic view of the universe was studied by the church during the Middle Ages. And the church said, that looks pretty good. Let's make it official dogma. And so the Ptolemaic view of the universe was taught to be the official creed of the Roman Catholic Church. It was taught to be the biblical teaching. In other words, the Ptolemaic view was basically baptized into the dogmas and creeds of the church. Well, that's no problem until a Polish mathematician by the name of Nicholas Copernicus was born. He was born in 1473, 10 years before Martin Luther. Now, Copernicus looked into the heavens. He was familiar with the Ptolemaic view, and he said, this doesn't make any sense. The moon's going that way, the sun's going this way, you got the stars going this way, and the planets going that way, and there's got to be a better explanation. And with his mathematical insight, it just came to him that, it would make a lot more sense if we looked at the universe this way. The Earth is spinning, and spinning while it's going around the sun. And all of a sudden, all of these things are much easier and simpler and more elegantly explained. And so the Copernican revolution was simply that point in scientific history where someone postulated that it's not the Earth at the center of the universe, but the sun, heliocentricity. Now, we would all think that represented a great step forward, except for the fact that the Church had already canonized the Ptolemaic view. Now, what happens when a person teaches something that is contradictory to the de fide dogma of the Church? What does that person become? A heretic, you see. So you have Copernicus, who is disenfranchised from the Church, but things got a lot worse with another individual who came sometime later, whose name was Galileo. Galileo was born in 1564. Okay, remember, Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558. So Galileo is born about 4 years after Elizabeth comes to the throne in England, just to keep your chronology straight here. Galileo, of course, is remembered chiefly for the fact that he refined and really improved dramatically by quantum measures the telescope. And so Galileo, impressed with the Copernican hypothesis, looks through his telescope and is able, by empirical observation, to confirm what Copernicus had only speculated about. He calls up the bishops of the church, says, "Guys, guess what? Copernicus was right. Come on down, look through my telescope." And the bishops of the Church of Rome refused to look through his telescope. And they branded Galileo as a heretic. Now, what I want you to appreciate, I'm not trying to level any massive criticisms against the Roman Catholic Church. It's not my object, because these are just facts of history that can be confirmed in any encyclopedia. But the point I'm driving at is that thinking people at the time began to scratch their heads. Now, wait a minute. Galileo looks through his telescope and confirms the Copernican hypothesis, and the church can only handle that by calling him a heretic? And thinking people at least began to wonder about the church. That's really been a big black eye, you see, in the history of the church. I mean, to this day, you hear people criticizing Christianity broadly because the church condemned Galileo back there in the 16th century. And it's a criticism that we have to, we have to see that at least from that time and from that point forward, there's been the question: can you really trust the church? And this becomes another shift. My whole point here is to say that in the Middle Ages, the church had monopolized thought, scholarship, art, music, commerce, politics, military, you name it. The church owned it. But by the time we're coming into the 16th century, some dramatically significant things had happened. The Renaissance had happened, the Reformation had happened, the scientific revolution had happened, and people were beginning to wonder about the church. And it sets up, philosophically and culturally, the Western world for the advent of an entirely new philosophical scheme. The period that we're talking about now, the late 16th century, was characterized then by some basic crises. There was, for example, what could be called the crisis of authority. The church classically had taught the doctrine, it was from Augustine, the doctrine of fides implicitum. Fides implicitum means that we place our implicit faith in the church. Translated into modern terms, that would be the church says it, I believe it, that settles it. You see, that's fides implicitum. If the church declares it, no questions asked, no critical examination of the thesis, we simply accept it, carte blanche, and leave it at that. And for a long time, the church had been able to sell that program, and people had simply accepted it. What else could they do, you see? But now we have the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and fides implicitum creates a crisis of authority, a crisis of trust. Can we really trust the church? All of these dogmas that we thought were so dependable are being cast up for grabs. It created a crisis of knowledge, that is, an epistemological crisis. Can we take what the church says as utterly trustworthy? It created, of course, most importantly, a crisis of faith, in which people began to question the fundamental tenets of Christian faith because the church had been proved wrong at points that could be tested. If the church says God is Trinity and the earth is at the center of the universe, and makes those two statements, both from the authority of the church, and we can test one of them, but we can't test the other one, you see. And we find out that the church was wrong at the point of geocentricity. What does that make us wonder about Trinity, you see? So you begin to see a crisis of faith that's also occurring, and it's this crisis in culture, a crisis of certainty, a crisis of knowing what's dependable that provokes a great movement in the history of the West, which is called, generally it's kind of gained the name, the Age of Reason, in which there's a shift away from dogmatic trust in the church and a shift toward rationality and reasonableness. And I'm going to deal with that in the second hour, but this is probably the best time to take a quick break, so let's do that. It's 5 after. We'll reconvene at 15 after, and then we'll take the rest of our time on the Age of Reason.